artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, this is episode 230. I am talking with Caroline Bassett, Professor of Digital Humanities. She's the first director of Cambridge Digital Humanities, an interdisciplinary research center in Cambridge University. She researches digital technologies and cultural change, focusing on critical theory, gender and technology, digital justice, AI, and generative writing. She's also the author of the book Anti-Computing, Dissent and the Machine, and at Cambridge, she inaugurated the Masters of Philosophy in Digital Humanities and last month launched the new doctoral program in Digital Humanities. Last week we talked about what digital humanities is, how it intersects with AI, what science and the humanities have to learn from each other, technocratic rationality, Joseph Weizenbaum and the reactions to his Eliza chatbot, Luddites, and how passively or otherwise we accept new technology. As we wrap up today, we're going to talk about how technology shapes our psychology, how it enables mass movements, science fiction, the role of big Silicon Valley companies, and much more. So let's get back into the interview with Caroline Bassett. So it's easy here to find negative consequences from AI being used to engage humans in ways that cause that suspension of disbelief and wanting to engage with it more on a visceral or emotional level. And this has got to be one of the places where you live in your research, right?
It is right, although I'm really more interested in thinking about this stuff as in relation to the social world than in relation to an individual's psychology. I am very unconvinced by the whole addiction discourse. I do believe that these things are very seductive, that they have a pull, that the way that they're organized and the way that they are programmed, if you like, is precisely in order to encourage browsing, to encourage doom scrolling, to encourage all of those things. But I'm not really sure that it's an adequate response is simply to say, there is more dopamine in their brains when they do X or X or X, because I'm not sure what that tells you in the end. And I think that it's a very confused discourse because you shift from addiction to evolution to social change to the idea of permanently diminished attention deficient individuals. And I'm not sure that that's a useful way to think about what's going on here. I would be very interested as a kind of speculative thought experiment, to ask what would happen if those things weren't there 10 years from now. Is it useful to think about these things as addiction and addiction recovery and that discourse, which is often monetized, by the way? I mean, the idea that you pay for an app to stop you using your phone has always struck me as absolutely bizarre.
But it is part of the world. And I'm reminded that Sam Harris disconnected himself from Twitter and said he became a better person for it, or he had been a worse person than he really was on Twitter. And it's certainly something that I can understand easily. Yeah. And so that's something that, again, we don't necessarily want to get sucked into the whole question of what cabals are forming to do this and keep us subjugated to this. It's sufficient to say that it's accidental.
Do you think you were a better person using Twitter when Twitter was better?
Well, you're talking about before it became X. I didn't use it that much.
I was thinking about early Twitter when there were some people that were using it extremely intensively who might be said to be subject to the same rhythms, if you like. So they were using it a lot. Their attention was chunked in a Twitter-like fashion. But I don't think at the time people thought that it was dangerous or addictive. Whereas now, because we're worried about the uses to which it's being put and the way it's being monetized, it's much easier to say there's something bad about it as a medium. And I'm slightly unconvinced.
I think not as the medium per se. It's like not the road, but the cars that are being driven on it and where they're going. Yeah. So Like, for instance, I remember the Wall Street Journal study of, it was TikTok, but you could apply the same thing to Twitter or anything else. The recommender algorithm had the effect of radicalizing people. Whatever their tendency was, it would lead them down a road where it became more and more extreme. And that has the effect of polarizing society and creating divisions, which also serves the aims of certain external entities. But that's another discussion that we don't have to get into. But that was created as a byproduct of the recommender algorithm simply being told, here, machine learning, learn whatever pattern causes people to engage with this platform more. And they didn't expect or want that people would become more radicalized as a result of that. But that's nevertheless a bug in the algorithm.
And now they're coding for it. So
yes.
Yeah, it is incredibly powerful. It's difficult to think through without thinking also about the more diffuse forms of society and culture that sit behind it and around it and through it. So I'm very wary of saying that the recent riots in Britain were caused by social media, although I will absolutely accept that they were exacerbated by them, co-organized by them, and actually that the response to those riots, which was anti-racist demonstrations, was also helped by people using the same networks, actually. So I'm worried about saying technology produces social ends. I think it's more complicated than that, which isn't to say that I would still be on X.
But perhaps it facilitates and accelerates things that we want to do anyway. It just amplifies and provides the means of doing those things. So you can get a flash mob together in minutes instead of having to send out flyers.
Yeah, that's right. And then that has impacts. I had a big fight the other day about the word, whether we should talk about acceleration or transformation, because to think about acceleration is somehow to assume that you're simply speeding up a process that might have been laid out already. Whereas I think transformation implies that there's a qualitative and as well as a quantitative change. And I think that is what we're looking at. So I'm really not saying that, when I say I don't think that X caused the riots in Britain the other month, I'm not saying it wasn't a huge factor, and also that it didn't structure how they happened. So the ways in which their combinations put themselves together, I think, is very interesting. But I don't think that those are an interesting example to me, because they also wouldn't have happened without the British tabloid press and without Brexit and these big macro things happening as well, and the cultural forms that kind of map along with that.
Perhaps in the sense that you wouldn't say that the M1 caused intermodal transportation to take off, but it certainly helped.
Yeah, though it doesn't now, does it? It's impossible to get down.
Well,
but
there is that too.
Yeah, it structured it. I would go further than saying it helped. I would say it structured it. You know, there are network effects of a network, and that's very important. And that's one reason why AI is so hugely significant, I think, because it really is so pervasive, and it is going to have such huge effects in so many dimensions. And also because we're talking about a computational culture which is being addressed by computational modes of analysis and computational action. So there's this kind of circuit, which I don't think is entirely a cybernetic circuit, but I think it's very powerful.
Let me try to bring this to another level that might be a little more concrete, which is to explore what kind of dent you'd like to make on the world right now. If you could wave a wand and get any group in the country or the world to come into the room, however large a room you needed, and would listen to you and your colleagues, who would that be and what would you tell them?
The first thing I'd do would be to say we'll be in this room for some decades. The second thing I'd say is we're not in one room, we're in a network. The third thing would be, how can we work to build an environment, build tools, build AI, which is from the ground up designed with the interests of a set of people's, societies, cultures, and differences in mind, rather than in the interests of the market. It's very simple, actually. And that would change hugely how you built platforms, how you organized stacks, not only how you thought about representation, but how you organized traffic, where and how you thought about AI research and where it should go next, what your aims were. And I think it would also have huge bearing on how you judged the outcomes of what you were doing. And perhaps that's a very diffuse answer, but I think if you went back to the Human Genome Project, this idea that the way to push forward was to map the whole human, that turned out to be kind of a really big idea, but not as useful perhaps as aiming to understand many of those problems from many directions and to think about them at different scales and levels. And I think one of the things that needs to happen with AI is to stop thinking about universal outcomes for universal humans and to think about what would happen if some of the key AI problems, things like homogenization, were thought of in cultural terms, in terms of difference. And if some of the questions about intelligence and creativity were thought through differently by re-examining what those terms meant in the first place. So I think something that questions some basic assumptions, but both assumptions about the human as well as the machine is where I would start, which wouldn't be a small project.
And who most needs to hear this? If you get individual or company or government or team to listen to you, who, if they took what you said to heart, could make the most difference that you would like to see?
It's extremely difficult to think what anybody who is not one of the huge Silicon Valley companies can do to make an immediate difference, actually. But I think one of the things I wouldn't want to do is to try and recruit Google to my side or recruit whoever to my side. I think that the role of the humanities or many kinds of social research, if you like, is to build a different way of thinking about what this stuff should be and to do that across a series of spheres and areas and to make a case for difference. And that might sound very diffuse, but I think as long as you are simply taking money to solve technical problems from the big tech companies, you're trapped in this technological solution outlook where you can never really come back to rethinking some of the questions that really matter. So one example of this might be thinking about bias, right? So everybody is interested in bias. Partly, even the Silicon Valley companies are interested in bias because they have to be. Partly, I think, because people like Ruha Benjamin in the social sciences have made the case around racial bias, partly because of things like Microsoft Tay. And obviously, people in the humanities are interested in questions of bias and representation and questions of social power. So everybody's interested in bias. The tech industries are trying to produce a technological fix for technological bias. A much more interesting place to start is to say everybody is situated. There's no false objective universal. Why not start from situation or situated positionality or admit there's no view from nowhere and look at how bias can be generative and how and in what way. And that's a different way of looking. And it's powerful, actually. I don't think it immediately fixes X's problem with bias, and I don't think it necessarily helps the EU to regulate for hate speech either, but it forces a different agenda.
Are you saying that your reluctance perhaps to engage with Google directly, if given the opportunity, is because if you were doing that, you might get co-opted into solving their problems rather than the ones that you think more important?
I think partly there are many people in this university who would accept money from Google, and there's many places where that might make a lot of sense in computer science, for example. But it does seem to me that it's worth having and worth thinking about how this stuff might be different if it wasn't being designed by people for whom maximization for market use is not the first and second and final priority. And that to do that, you have to try and find a place where you're using this stuff, you're inside it, and you may be excited about it as well, but you're not aligned with it. So I think it's finding and building platforms that can critically engage with this stuff. And then I think the real issue is how to make those platforms effective. And that's extremely difficult. And maybe some of the ways that can be done is through things my center is trying, but alliances of centers, alliances of organizations and groups and research centers that are doing that in multiple ways in different places. And that would include things like media art, would include things like people looking at literature, people exploring social activism in the media. So I think it's a question of an alliance which produces a different kind of technological milieu, really.
And fiction, I believe you have an upcoming or perhaps recently completed seminar series about digital innovation and fiction. And was it Philip K. Dick or something else with those initials?
Yeah, we've been looking at the Philip K. Dick project was quite an old one, but I'm consistently returned to questions of science fiction as a way to broaden the horizon of possible futures. So Silicon Valley tends to think of what's possible. So its time scale is rather foreshortened, actually, complicated, I guess, by long-termism, but we probably shouldn't go there. But I think science fiction is very interesting as a site where it's possible to rethink the possibilities for forms of technological culture in ways that can step out of the horizons of the given. And so I am very interested in that. And not only Philip K. Dick, but also feminist science fiction. So people like Le Guin or people, particularly environmental fiction. And I think fiction in general is an interesting site or a generative site to think about what AI can do, both sometimes in terms of content. So utopian science fiction as thinking the future differently, but also actually fiction's interesting to explore what AI is and what natural language processing is. I mean, when you think about it, NLP is kind of making things up. I mean, it's predictive possibility, right? Fiction's another place where that is happening. So these discussions about meaning and intentionality that AI discourse is full of are being asked in literature all the time. And one of the things that interests me about that is it's all very well to say that nothing that an AI makes, if only an AI makes it, counts as art. You know, if an AI makes music, it doesn't count. I think that's what people would say about an AI-generated imitation of Bach. My question would be, okay, if this stuff which Chat has made or GPT, an earlier version, has made, if it doesn't count, if it doesn't mean anything, if it's not a song, if it's not a composition, if it's not art, I think we have to ask what it is.
Right. Well, my reaction to that assertion has always been, are you saying that if I'm listening to a piece of music, I cannot determine what my reaction to it is until I learn who or what wrote it?
Yeah. And of course, that's ludicrous because, of course, you can and you do. And I don't think that's only about reception. I don't think it's only about how you interpret what you're given loosely. It's not a matter of, 100% how. It also matters what's made, and what's made cybernetically is there, and we need to come to terms with what claims it makes. And I think that's, really matters, actually, because there's going to be more and more of it. So if literature or the arts is useful in thinking about AI, to come back to your question, but on a much more modest scale, which might be a better one, it might be because it can actually address the cultural artifacts of an AI age and make sense of them. And therefore make sense of how public discourse is when a lot of it is generated by AIs.
And you reference Dave Eggers' book, The Circle, which is one of my favorites, and certainly goes into exploring how digital technologies can shape a dystopian world that we don't even realize is dystopian. I suppose most, if not all, dystopias are ones that we don't know are dystopian, or we would change it. But he clearly seems to be making that point that, hey, look, this is where we're going.
Something that's really interesting, my students are very interested in this book, is Clara and the Sun, the Ishiguro book. And that's because somehow that book, which is about a rather self-sacrificing robot companion who attempts to sacrifice her life blood to the person she cares for. One reason I think that book's so interesting is because somehow Ishiguro gets at or asks a question about modes of perception that might come from machinic vision. And it's fictional, but the way that he explains what it might be to experience artificial vision, if you like, or a world which is gridded, setting aside the question of whether that person is conscious or human or not, is very interesting. So I think literature can get at or run thought experiments about emerging kinds of culture, art, forms of life. So it's very hard to get at through either industrial fabulation or sociological investigation. So I think it's interesting, and it's often interesting when it's less elaborated, less finished.
That's certainly where Philip K. Dick was going over and over again, was writing stories where technology was the excuse for us to think about how do we know who we are over and over again. And now people are starting to look at ways of extending technology. People are invested in creating ways of uploading minds when they haven't the slightest idea how to do that, but it doesn't stop them thinking about that. And of course, science fiction has already gone there to ask questions like, how will you know which one is you, and so forth, which might not have any immediate application now, but you can look at these questions of, well, what's the role of memory? And also you can look at many of these things and say, how does this help us decide whether we will have a true general intelligence in AI when it shows up? How should we decide that that's happened?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Although I think the relationship between science fiction and technology it's complicated to think through. And one of the distinctions that I would make would be between thinking about science fiction as puzzle cases, so, thought experiments, and thinking about science fiction as utopian extrapolation, to put it like that. And I think the two are both useful, but actually quite distinct. And one of the reasons is that the kind of puzzle case idea, maybe McIntyre, the kind of puzzle case idea which says, we can use science fiction to understand if you're a copy of yourself, are you yourself? That's one of the classic puzzle case science fiction cases. And that's very interesting. It tends to be worked through at the level of plot. It's a sort of speculative proposition, right?
Well, all fiction should be story first and foremost, or it's not going to work.
But I think that I don't know, actually, I'm not sure about that, but I was thinking about Olga Ravin and The Workplace, which is not quite a story. But I think one of the distinctions would be that the puzzle case is a kind of proposition that's then tested. I think in things like the Ishiguro, the Clara and the Sun, for example, the interest is not so much in the plot. It's to do with the affective, to do with the emotional world in which one is put. So you're testing out a different kind of set of responses. It's less of a puzzle case and more of a form of immersion, speculative immersion in something else. And I think that is quite different, actually. I mean, the third way of thinking about science fiction, which governments like, is people invent the future and they don't have to invest in technology, which is the Arthur C. Clarke thing,
Yes. Well, and this brings us back to where we started, which is the different ways in which humanities and literature, as we were just saying there, causes us to question and extend our experience that may not be part of the reduced number of dimensions that AI is using those things for right now. And perhaps that brings us back here at the close here to the purpose of the Cambridge Digital Humanities and the other works that you're engaged upon right now. And so perhaps you could sum up by telling us where those are going right now, your current lines of research, where we can find out more about those, and where you hope this leads in the future.
Okay. Well, my current project is to try and think about thinking. And by that, I'm really interested in not so much in thinking about can AI think. So many people are thinking about whether AI can think. I think there's enough people thinking about that. I could never say that twice. I'm more interested in exploring what it means for humans to be working with radically expanded forms of artificial memory, what it means to be living in a memory present, how structures of knowledge will shift. So I'm trying to think about the epistemological consequences of the current changes that are fueled by AI. And I'm partly interested in thinking about that in relation to earlier moments in which cultures were interested in automatic knowing, automatic knowledge, things like sleep learning, which of course never worked, libraries. So that my project is to try and understand the stakes of the kind of knowledge cultures that human and machines are making together, really, to step around the question of what is machine intelligence. I don't think it's clear, and I don't think we can define it while we're using the wrong definitions of intelligence anyway. So that's my project at the moment. CDH is a beautiful, broad church. So we have natural language processors exploring computational literature. We have AI and artificial image researchers exploring ways in which distant viewing of large catalogues of images could change the way we understand the power of visual culture in relation to resistance, archives of resistance, actually. And we're also really interested in thinking about social justice and AI. That's a big project for us. So we have an MPhil. We're starting a doctoral program in exactly 2 weeks from now, so that will be frightening. And we run data schools because we're also concerned to be connected to many, many people who are not Cambridge researchers, but who are journalists or artists who are outside those purely academic milieu. So that's what we're doing, really. We're trying to think about what kind of critical tools, critical orientations can we develop and explore to produce a generative response to AI that is both critical of it as it is and understands what could be done with it. I think that's what we're trying to do, which is obviously huge.
So thank you for giving us that insight into your work. It was a lot to pack into the last hour or so, and particularly because what you're doing here is by its nature something that isn't and shouldn't be that simply explicated, because that's the realm of AI. You're doing something that is more subtle and sublime. And I thank you for having communicated some part of that to us here so that we pick up the essence of that through this osmosis, if you will.
Thank you. It was great. It was really interesting and hard.
Well, good. We aim to please. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's the end of the interview. There's a link to Caroline's book in the show notes and transcript. Going back a few years, we talked about Philip K. Dick before in episode 53, part of the AI in Science Fiction panel. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI will be used to diagnose broken bones under new British NHS plans, according to new guidance from the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which has the delightfully British acronym of NICE. This marks a significant shift in how emergency departments handle X-ray analysis. With a 15% shortage of radiographers, this can make a real difference once it's proven out. It will be used in English urgent care settings, while further real-world evidence is gathered. X-rays will also be reviewed separately by a trained healthcare professional. In emergency rooms, fractures are the most common diagnostic error. Missed or delayed fracture diagnoses on radiographs occur in approximately 3 to 10% of cases due to the immense workload in radiology departments. Fragility fractures cost the UK around £4.4 billion a year, with hip fractures alone accounting for 69,000 emergency admissions in England. By the way, for each one of you out there listening to this show, there's another 10,000 people out there who would love to listen to it if they only knew about it. I totally made up that figure, but if we've learned anything from ChatGPT, it's that if you say something convincingly enough, most people will believe it. So please, give us a 5-star rating and positive review on the podcasting platform of your choice. Next week, we'll have a special show when I'll be talking with a panel of educators about their experiences with AI, how it's impacting them, and what they need. Let's see what we can find out and how we can help next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.